Awesome. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a privilege to kind of be asked to present. Um, so what I want to talk about today is really so that's me as my YouTube, but I want to kind of cover an Azure AD 101, kind of think about an overview of Azure Active Directory, because when we think about the cloud, it is so important to really understand identity really enables everything. Identity is the new perimeter when we think about security and access. Um, I'm going to kind of skip who I am. Kind of done all that already. But what I want to cover, and this is really to remind me as we go through this, is exactly what is Azure AD and how does it relate to AD? We're probably used to the idea of Active Directory. So what exactly is this Azure AD thing? I want to talk about the authentication options, including federation, really why we would pick one, what they give us, seamless single sign-on, what that means, federation with enterprise applications. If you were to say what's the biggest feature of Azure AD, a lot of people say it's a federation broker. Today, most of the applications we use are not housed on premises. There's some cloud app. And if it's a cloud application, well, how are we authenticating with that? And I'm going to talk about that and see what we can do with Azure AD to help with that. Ones that are built in, ones that maybe we need to manually add, ones that maybe we want to publish and make available to other people. What exactly is this conditional access thing? How does that play into MFA? We constantly hear about MFA today. Passwords are bad. We need MFA. So what does Azure AD do in terms of MFA? And then privileged identity management, kind of if we have time. And then again, if we have time, how Azure AD relates to Azure subscriptions and those kind of things. So this is really kind of what I want to cover. I may jump back to this to remind myself of where we are. I think the plan is I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. And then after that, I'll kind of look at the questions. I've kind of got a screen down here. So if you see me looking down, I'm maybe trying to see if there's any questions or anything. I'll try and keep my eye out. But really, I'll kind of cover those towards the end. So let's kind of get to it. Let's really focus on, well, what is this thing? Why have I lost my ability to do my mouse? Oh, I see. Okay. So let's go to my whiteboard. So if I think about authentication, directory services, we're all used to the idea of Active Directory. This was Active Directory domain services. This is what we had on premises. And that Active Directory, we had user accounts stored in there, we had groups in there, we had machines that were registered in there. And those machines that were registered in there, well, they had a secret. There was a secret they shared with the domain. And that let them be able to do certain things. I could consume resources from other machines in the domain. And what we did is this was already considered to be on a network. We all had really free-flowing communication between the servers, between the domain controller. And that was good when things were on-prem. Active Directory would speak things like Kerberos. It would speak things like NTLM. It would speak things like LDAP. These were authentication protocols, querying, get information protocols, and they worked fantastic. But then we started to use the cloud. And so we had this cloud thing pop up. And in this cloud, we had these kind of SaaS applications, software as a service. This could be a Microsoft SaaS app like Office 365. It could be SAP. It could be any number of systems. Well, we now wanted to be able to use those cloud applications. But things like Kerberos and NTLM were no use for that. What I didn't want to do is have a completely separate identity for my users up here. Separate identities are horrible for everyone. They're horrible for that company hosting the app because now they have to host a whole set of identities. They have to give features to enable me to reset my password when I forget it. It's horrible for me as a company because, well, if the user leaves the company, How do I quickly deprovision them so they can't access that cloud app anymore? And it's horrible for the user that I now have to have another account that I have to remember. And what it means is I'll use the same password. I'll use the same password for 10 different cloud applications, 10 different cloud accounts, which is now horrible for my company again, because if one of those cloud apps gets compromised and I've used the same password, well, I've now compromised my corporate identity as well. So what was used was this thing called federation. So we would host a federation service on premises. We'd have some internet facing servers, we'd have kind of a load balancer, we'd have the back-end services doing this, like ADFS was an example of a solution. And these federation services would then speak things like SAML, maybe WS Fed if it was more Microsoft focused. So now when I want to access one of these applications, I can actually get a SAML token that would make assertions, claims about me, which that SaaS app would consume. And I'm now using that same identity on these cloud applications. There's a lot of work here. To do this type of communication, well, I have to manage kind of the claims. I have to manage kind of the certificate. So there's all these things I have to manage when I do federation. So let's think, where does Azure AD play in this picture? So enter Azure AD. Now it's important to note, it's called Azure AD. It is not AD. There are no domain controllers. It's called Azure AD because AD had a good trusted brand and it was a clever, I think, marketing to say, hey, it's Azure AD. There's a confusion that people think this is Active Directory in the cloud. It is not. There are no domains. I heard someone talk about, hey, it's when you create an Azure AD instance in Azure, by default, you get a something domain.onmicrosoft.com. And someone thought on Microsoft.com was the root domain, and then whatever you create is a child domain of that. It's a DNS name. There is no on Microsoft.com domain. It's just that's the kind of the root, the suffix part of the DNS name of your Azure AD. There is no relationship between different Azure AD tenants. There is no root on Microsoft.com Azure AD domain. So we create an Azure AD instance. And I can create any number of these. By default, it will be something.onmicrosoft.com, but I can give it a custom name. I could, for example, I do saviltech.net is my kind of lab Azure AD. The key part about Azure AD is it talks cloud. So it talks OpenID Connect. That's used for authentication for modern applications. It talks OAuth 2. So that lets me do authorization. Now, often people confuse it with authentication. It's really not. OAuth 2 is about authorization. I'm consenting something can work on my behalf. That's what OAuth 2 is all around. But it also speaks SAML. It also speaks WS Fed. Notice it is not speaking Kerberos. It is not speaking NTLM. It is not speaking LDAP. There is something called Azure AD Domain Services that kind of takes the records and pushes them into managed domain controllers for a virtual network. That's a very specific use case. Ordinarily, Azure AD does not speak any of the same things as Active Directory. So now we have this Azure AD thing that speaks cloud. It speaks those cloud protocols. Now, what do we do with that? Well, I can now easily integrate with all those cloud applications. Azure AD has built in thousands, so we have X, thousands of these apps kind of pre-federated. So if I was to actually go and look for a second at an Azure AD, if I go and look at enterprise applications, if I say new application, and here we can see from the gallery there's 3,559 apps built in. Some of those will be OAuth based. Some of them will be SAML based. Some might be WS Fed based. Some of them, well, that app doesn't support any of those things. So it will just be like a credential stuffing. Essentially what happens is, as the administrator, I have a choice. I can say, hey, look, I want to make this available to the user. The first time they access it, prompt them for a credential and we'll remember it. We'll fill that in on subsequent access. Or, as the administrator, I set the credential. And then it will automatically be populated when a user accesses that site. Think about Twitter. I have a corporate Twitter marketing account. I don't want to give the marketing department the password to my corporate Twitter. So I could add Twitter. I would specify the credential. Azure AD can even roll the password automatically for me. And then I would grant the marketing department users permissions to access that app. So it would then show up in their portal. They could click the button and it would just seamlessly sign them in using that kind of cached credential that I've configured. So there's different ways this works, but fundamentally Azure AD has a huge number of these built in. Now, if there's an app you need to use that isn't built in, I can have my own. I can define my own kind of SAML, my WS Fed. I can add OAuth 2 applications. I could publish things from on-premises using Azure AD App Proxy. And then it can pre-auth and then actually then use Kerberos, for example, on the back end. So what it's essentially going to let me do is, hey, I've got identities here. It's going to extend those identities out so I can now use all the cloud goodness, all those cloud apps. And again, I'm talking about SaaS. So Office 365 would be an example of this. So Office 365 trusts an Azure AD instance. If I, for example, have Azure subscriptions trust a particular Azure AD tenant for the identities that they give role-based access control to actually get access. So that's where Azure AD plays. It's this critical piece that provides that cloud identity. Now there's a gap though, right? So great, I've got accounts here. I've got Azure AD up here. How do I connect those two things together? So I can create cloud accounts. I could absolutely just go into Azure AD and create users. But I don't really want to do that. Then it's a different account, a separate password again. Nothing good comes out of that. I was saying earlier, I apologize. I just finished training, so I'm kind of thirsty. What I want to do is extend this identity up to the cloud. Now, the way we do that, there is a component called Azure AD Connect. Now, I only want one instance of this live. So I deploy this, and what this is essentially doing, if you've ever seen, it's got so many different names, MIIS, ILM, FIM, MIM, kind of the identity management solution. It's a mini version of that. And what this Azure AD Connect does is I can think about, it really has these kind of connector spaces. So it has a connector space that takes the objects from on-prem, it merges them together in a metaverse, and then sends them to Azure AD. And that is the direction. AD is the source of truth. I cannot create objects in Azure AD and replicate them back down. There are some things I can manually write if I get into certain situations that I could go and scan Azure AD and create objects, but that's not the normal flow. The normal flow is AD is the boss. I create the objects in AD, and then it will create an equivalent object up in Azure AD. Now it is a separate object, but there's something called a source anchor. And that source anchor tells the Azure AD object, well, actually, you're related to this object down here. You're the equivalent object. So now I have this object in Azure AD. And I have to have them in Azure AD. So things like Office, for apps that trust Azure AD, for Azure. There is no scenario where I don't have the objects in Azure AD. So I've got these objects. There's an optional configuration. All of these users down here have a password hash. And one of the things that we can turn on is sending, it's not the password hash, it's a hash of the hash. It goes through 1,000 SHA iterations, there's a per user sort. You can't reverse it to find out the original hash. So what we can do is we can turn on this kind of hash of a hash. So that gets generated, this hash of a hash. And then we can store that up in Azure AD. And that is recommended. It's recommended for a number of reasons. Even if I don't plan to authenticate using Azure AD, by having that hash of a hash up there, it gives me certain protections. So Microsoft has this huge digital crimes unit, they're crawling the dark web. If it has this hash of a hash, when it crawls the dark web, when it finds leaked credentials, it can compare those leaked credentials and say, hey, does this password we've found on the dark web match this hash of the hash? If it does, then they know it's the real password, it's been leaked, they can notify you. You can perform actions with things like identity protection to say, hey, that user has to perform an MFA and change their password. So it can stop a breach replay type attack. Even if I'm using authentication on-prem, I'll talk about this in a second, if something goes wrong, if there's a ransomware attack, if I lose all my on-prem infrastructure, I can flip a switch and now do cloud authentication. There are other types of protections we do automatically as well with Cloud Auth. We know there are certain bad actors, we know there's malicious IP addresses, we can detect certain behaviors and we can stop those. So there's a lot of benefits and there's not really any downside. Some people kind of shiver at the idea of putting the hash up into Azure AD. The naming was poor originally. It used to be called password sync, and people are like, I'm not syncing my plain text password. It's not that. It was never that. It's a hash of the hash that's far more secure than the hash you have in AD. So again, even if this got hacked, which it never has, and it's stored far more securely than this one, you can't reverse engineer to get the original hash in Active Directory. So this is the recommended. We have the accounts in AD and we are extending those accounts into Azure AD through Azure AD Connect. And there's various advanced models. If I had multiple domains, for example, I could still bring them together through a single Azure AD Connect instance and sync them to one Azure AD. What I can't do is have things like multiple Azure AD Connects to the same Azure AD. There are restrictions there. And I only have one. I can run a second Azure AD Connect in a standby mode. It's kind of sitting there, but it's not actually replicating the objects. It's there in case something happened to this primary Azure AD Connect, and I could switch over. But realistically, if this was down for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, nothing really happens. New objects I create, they won't replicate up. Now, sure, if I reset my password, it wouldn't know. So I would break those types of notifications. But for the most part, if this was down for a short period of time, it's not going to have a huge impact. Okay, so we've got the objects. We've now extended our objects into Azure AD. What about the authentication? So the guidance used to be federate. Now you might be saying, wait, what do you mean federate? We've replicated the accounts. So that's getting the objects into Azure AD. But now I'm actually a user. I'm actually now this user over here. And I want to use a service that trusts Azure AD. So I need to authenticate. Now, if I'm going to authenticate, I have choices. And with federation, what that means is when I go, hey, Azure AD, I need some tokens. If I've chosen to federate, what happens is the authentication is actually redirected back to a federation server on premises. that would talk to Active Directory domain controllers, would authenticate my account, would send a token back to the user, and the user would then present that token to Azure AD, who would then perform authorization on me and then give me my access and refresh tokens. That was attractive initially because it would give me single sign-on. If I was on a machine that was joined to the domain and it had visibility to the domain, then I wouldn't be prompted for any kind of authentication when I went and used resources that trusted Azure AD. However, it's relying on-prem, which we're actually trying to move away from, and I had to maintain this big federation infrastructure, which again, remember, it has to have internet-facing services, it has to have load balancers, it has multiple servers. There's a lot of oomph to maintain this thing. And it's only doing authentication, it's not really doing authorization. You've probably heard about tokens in Azure AD and they live for 90 days, this refresh token. So even if I authenticate through federation, once I have my token, it doesn't get spoken to again. As long as that token, that refresh token is used and it will keep renewing, I can access as many apps as I want. It will never go back to this federation. So it's really not buying me very much. The authorization always happens in Azure AD. We're going to talk more about this, but the auth-z always happens in Azure AD. What I can select is where the authentication, the auth-n happens. So federation, that's what we kind of used to recommend for single sign-on, not anymore. So the recommended approach is cloud authentication. We send the hash of the hash. So when I authenticate, it authenticates directly against Azure AD. So if I'm doing cloud auth, I'm doing the auth-n here as well. So that's the cloud authentication when I have that hash stored. So I can change the configuration and I can say, hey, use cloud authentication. So we have preferred, least preferred. There is a middle option. You may hear about pass-through authentication. So pass-through authentication is the user still authenticates, it thinks against Azure AD, but what actually happens with pass-through is we actually run some pass-through authentication agents on-prem. When I authenticate, there's kind of a queue for each PTA agent. It's a service bus. Say, hey, this user wants to authenticate. The PTA establishes an outbound connection, reads the record, and kind of responds yes or no. It checks the account against domain controllers, and then the user is authenticated. The benefit that has is it's still checking against Active Directory for that initial authentication. But again, once you have that, it doesn't talk to this again because it has the refresh token. The refresh token is long-lived. I use that to go and get additional tokens for other types of applications. And with both cloud authentication and with pass-through authentication, there's something called seamless sign-on. So exactly the same user experience as federation. If I was on a machine that had line of sight to a domain controller, I wouldn't get prompted for authentication. There's a few flags and policies to set in terms of exactly what domains are whitelisted, so it's in a trusted site, so it actually performs, but that will then just work. So I get this seamless sign-on, cloud auth, pass-through authentication, and again, this is the preferred. Send the hash, authenticate directly against Azure AD. It's not dependent on anything down here. If you think about it, Azure AD is this global scale service. As soon as I have pass-through or federation, I'm relying on something on-prem that I have to manage, that I have to scale. And again, it's not buying me anything. If we think about, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but if we think about the flow, if we think about there's kind of a client and there's Azure AD and there's a service I want to access, when I say, hey, service, I want to use this service. Well, it will say you have no token, it will bounce me to Azure AD. Now at this point, Azure AD will kind of perform that authentication and authorization. Now, if I was using Federation, then this is the point where super quickly it would also bounce me to the Fed server for the authentication, which would give me a token back, and it would still perform authorization here. Assuming that passes, it would create a refresh token, which is kind of service agnostic, and it would give me an access token for that particular service. So it would send those back to me, and then I would use the access token it gave me. I'd send that along to talk to the service. That's how they work. Now, if I now want to talk to service 2, well, I have a refresh token. All I do is I send my refresh token to Azure AD, saying, hey, I want to talk to service 2. And it says, okay, well, here's an access token for service 2, and here's an updated refresh token extending its life. It sends that back to me, and then I send that new access token to the service 2. So if I was using Federation, if I was using partial authentication, sure, it gets called on the first authentication I perform if I don't already have a token, but then it's not used. So there's really not buying me very much. The focus should be on, hey, let's get that cloud authentication in the picture and focus on this authorization part, because the authorization part is happening again. Every time I say, hey, I want an access token, it reruns that authorization. And it does do some other checks, like if my password had been changed, if my account had been disabled. At that point, it would invalidate that refresh token. So it does do a few extra little checks. But essentially, every time I try and get an access token, it performs an authorization to say, hey, you're allowed to access this service that you're trying to access. And that's kind of a very key point. And that's one of the huge powers we have around Azure AD. So I talked about, okay, it's doing this auth-z. It's doing that authorization. And fundamentally, that is conditional access. So conditional access is about looking at various things. And actually, we can just look at one of these. So if we jump over, if we go back, if we look at our security, I can look at conditional access. I'll look at, doesn't really matter, I'll look at modern authentication. We have various properties of this. So I can see firstly, well, who am I assigning it to? I can do all users, select users, I could target guest users, I could target people with certain roles, and I can exclude certain people. Now this is very important. If you're testing something and you do all users, and let's say you picked all cloud apps and you did something wrong, you might lock yourself out. So I will normally exclude the cloud admins if I'm testing something, just so I have kind of a back door. It's not going to lock me out of my own environment. So I'm targeting users groups. I can then pick, well, which applications am I targeting? And one of the nice things we have now is actually user actions. And this is register security information. One of the weak points was that first configuration of my security info. Well, how do I know someone doesn't grab my account straight away and put in wrong phone numbers and register the wrong application? So now what we can actually do is use conditional access to say, hey, for registering my security info, maybe I have a policy that says you have to be on a corporate network. You have to be maybe on a corp join machine. So I can now actually lock down that initial security configuration. But any application I can target. This is one that's built in, it's one you've added, it's an app you've registered. Any of those things I can target as part of the policy. And then we have a whole bunch of different types of conditions. So I can do user risk, sign-in risk. These are all part of identity protection. So there's different SKUs of Azure AD. There's Azure AD kind of free. Then there's P1 and P2. So P1 is where we get things like conditional access. And that's normally kind of the minimum bar for enterprise use. I want conditional access. I want MFA. MFA is part of P1 as well. And then P2, well, that gives me things like identity protection. It's going and looking at those dark web. It's looking at the user's behavior. It's looking at anomalous behavior, things that are out of the ordinary. And it gives me a risk for both the user overall and this specific sign-in session. So that's a P2 along with PIM, privileged identity management, the ability to elevate up my permissions, along with things like access reviews. Who's got this permission? Who's got this role? Who's got this RBAC? Who's got access to this application? I can target device platforms. Hey, is it Windows? Is it iOS? Is it Windows Phone? If it's Windows Phone, it's probably super suspicious. Only super criminals will be using Windows Phone anymore. I can pick locations. A location is something I can configure. So a location can be a geographical region, or it can be IP addresses I specify. So if I know my office has a NAT device that does that internet facing traffic, has a certain IP, I can specify, hey, if it's coming from this IP, this is my office location X, treat it a certain way. Now, ideally, we try not to trust locations anymore. We kind of think of this zero trust model. I don't want to rely on you're in this location. Someone might get into my location. Someone's visiting, they plug a device into a printer port. So there's always a little bit of risk with just trusting location, but it's there as an option. And then I can target things like client apps, device state, and then we have controls. So my controls, hey, require MFA. Make them do a multi-factor authentication. That could be a text message, that could be a phone call, it could be on my authenticator app. There's different types of MFA that are kind of supported there. Make sure the device is marked as compliant. That would come from Intune, Windows Defender, ATP. Make sure it's hybrid joined. So I pick and I can say they need all of them or they need some of them. Notice there's this new require password change. So that's you'll see things that are in preview. And then there are session controls. Session controls let me do things like, hey, if it was SharePoint, I could say, look, this is not in a corporate location. I'm going to let you access SharePoint, but you can't download anything. You can just read these certain types of documents. So I can control what the session, I can do a restricted session. And I can do things like making you re-sign in, re-authenticate. I can say if browser sessions are persisted, normally I click a box to say, hey, persist, remember me. I can override it with things like conditional access. I can create terms of use. I can create PDF documents that they have to accept before they can actually go and use that application. So this is kind of the power. Conditional access really does everything in terms of that authorization. Now, there are kind of some extensions. When I talk about kind of this grant, there are ways you can kind of hook into like other MFA providers like Duo. There are things that can kind of add into this. So if I was using non-Azure AD MFA, I can hook that into these types of behavior as well. So there are ways to plug other things into this. But this is what drives your authorization. You don't want to just turn on MFA for every single authentication. And that's kind of a bad thing. You might think that's a good thing. Hey, MFA every single time, that's going to be the most security. It really doesn't. It just trains your users to, hey, look, I'm always getting prompted for this thing. Yes, 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 yes. They're not thinking about it. And so if a bad actor is doing something and the user sees an MFA prompt, they'll just click yes. It's far better to only make them MFA if we detect an anomaly, we detect some heightened risk, we detect they're trying to elevate their permissions. That's really what the guidance is. The same for passwords. We don't really recommend make people change their passwords constantly Because all they do is they change it password 1, password 2, password 3. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't buy you really any extra security. It's better to just really focus on things like, hey, let's detect risk and do things like MFA if we detect it. If I can, things like Windows Hello for Business. On our devices, we're not using a password. We're actually using the TPM in our device. We can use biometrics. That's a per device authentication. There's no password used. So if we can get to those things, that's even better. Okay, so that's authorization. These are users in my organization, and that's fantastic. Great. What about people I work with? What about people in other companies? How does that play? And so we have something called B2B. So if I'll scroll over here, we have Azure AD. This is my Azure AD. And I have some resource that trusts that Azure AD. So when I think about I have accounts in here, if I have ACLs, they're based on accounts in this particular Azure AD. Now I'm working with a partner, and I want that partner to be able to get access to this thing as well. So they need some kind of account in here. I don't want to create a new account for them. Remember, that's the whole problem we used to have. I want them to use their existing account. So maybe they're from a company that has their own Azure AD. I can invite them in. I can do a B2B. They become a guest user, an external account, an external and other Azure AD. But they're now really just like anyone else. I can give that account access to ACLs. What if they don't have Azure AD? So I can also, it could be a Microsoft account, an MSA, that more social. I can add that via B2B. What if they're a Gmail account? I can add that via B2B. What if they're a company that has their own kind of federation? Well, I can add that. I can add SAML via, and I can add those to B2B. And if they're just someone else who has none of those things, we have an OTP. As long as they've got an email address, I can add them with B2B. What is OTP? One-time passcode. Every time they try to authenticate, they'll be sent an email message. It will have a code in it. That's what they will type in as their password. What does that do? It proves they still have access to their email box. So if they left the company, you would assume that company would have taken away that account, that mailbox, so they won't be able to receive the OTP. They will lose the access. In all of these things, all of these B2Bs, I can now, for all of these types of account, do things over here. There's kind of a line down here. And it's the authentication is here. The authorization is here. I'm not maintaining any password for any of these accounts. The authentication is whatever is done there. I don't have to reset passwords or worry about them. But the authorization is on me. And if you remember the flow, conditional access, that also means MFA is over here. So if they have MFA on their account, if they've done an MFA already, don't care. This is not trusted in terms of authorization. Today, if this had already MFA'd, it is not sent across as something we trust. They will MFA again if the conditional access on this side says MFA is required. So they would have to set up MFA on their authenticated device for this tenant as well. Now you might say, okay, well, you said conditional access was a P1 feature. How do they get licensed? So the nice thing is, for kind of the SKUs, for every one person that is licensed on this side, 5 B2B users can use that capability. So if I had 100 people licensed for P1, 500 B2B guest users have access to P1 functionality as well. So they could do the conditional access, they could do MFA. I don't have to pay for those again. So that's something that's kind of just inherent, is built in, that I can leverage that. This is what we want to focus on. I don't want to create accounts for my guests. I want them to bring their existing identity. And this really does cover the full gambit. Be it, hey, they've got an Azure AD, a Microsoft account, a Gmail account, a Fed, or they just need an email address. Most people have one of those things, and so then I can invite them over. And the key part is I'm not now worrying about accounts. They take care of the accounts. There are still things I need to check. I can think about things like access reviews. So access reviews, this lets me say, hey, do you have this role? Are you a member of this group? Do you have this application? And I can say on a certain interval, every 3 months, do an access review. I can delegate to a certain manager. It can be a self-review. So we can say, hey, anyone who has this, they have to go and confirm, yeah, I still want this. I still need this capability. So this is kind of a higher up governance. This is actually a P2 capability. Also, these guests, well, what about if I have a lot of them? Now I can script this stuff, but there are also kind of now this governance capability. I can create these entitlement packages. An entitlement package says, hey, these tenants, so these possible people out there, they're allowed to use this. It's going to give them this role. It's going to give them access to this SharePoint site. It's going to add them to this group. And it's going to last for 90 days. And now people can just go to a URL and self-sign up. They can go and self-sign up, and now they'll be added as a B2B. They're going to get those roles, that SharePoint site access, whatever that is, and now can just consume it. So that's kind of a nice capability for that more higher end governance. Now I do want to stress, this is B2B. This is for people I'm partnering with, people I'm collaborating with. If they're just pure customers, I'm probably going to use B2C. B2C is completely separate. B2C is not part of this Azure AD. B2C actually is a separate type of object. You can kind of customize every pixel. It supports more kind of social type identities like Twitter and Weibo and Facebook. There's a whole bunch of them. That's where, and it can even create local accounts. So if the user doesn't have a social identity they want to use, they can just say, hey, I'll create an account instead. So that they have that capability. So think that there's really 2 options. There's, hey, I'm collaborating with you, B2B. You're my customer, and I'm writing some application that wants to tie into Azure AD capabilities. B2C has its own MFA. With B2C, you'll build per authentication and per MFA. That's the way it kind of works. So I can have as many objects as I want, but you'll build based on the authentications and the number of MFAs. They're built separately. You get a certain amount for free of the authentications, and then you pay for ones over that. So that's how I would do that kind of customer-facing application if I want to host my own kind of directory for those. Okay, so I know I've only got a couple of minutes left based on my content. Federation, conditional access, seamless sign, authentication options. Just trying to make sure I've covered kind of everyone to cover. So I think that's kind of the main stuff I'm going to talk about. I mean, there's things like PIM, Privileged Identity Management. I don't want to have people with standing privileges. The point of PIM is it lets me say, hey, this person, they're allowed to have this role, but it's not there by default. They can elevate up. So when they do that elevation, if it's a very privileged role, you have to do an MFA. If it's not so privileged, I get to pick. I can do that for Azure AD roles. I can do that for Azure Resource Manager roles. And it's super important to realize Azure AD and Azure are separate. Azure AD instances do not live within a subscription. Azure AD sits above everything. Subscriptions trust an Azure AD instance, but Azure Resources has its own role-based access control model. Azure AD has their own roles that are used for Azure AD, that are used for Office 365. If I use things like Windows Hello for Business, well, that is a strong authentication. So if I do a Windows Hello for Business authentication, that counts as I've done an MFA. So I won't then get prompted to do another MFA. Windows Hello for Business, remember, it's something I have, it's that particular machine, and then it's either something I know, a PIN, or it's something I am, kind of biometric. So that is a strong authentication. That counts as, hey, you've done that strong auth. You wouldn't then get prompted for MFA. You've kind of done that already. So that is me. That's done my 45 minutes. I hope that was kind of useful. With that, I guess we'll open it up to kind of questions. It can be about this. It can be kind of an ask me anything, I guess, type thing. Happy to address anything that's out there.